Welcome to Defining Dad Bod, where my dad, Coach Alex VanHouten, posts his 14 years of experience to work for you. You should listen to him. Here's Pretty Beast Mode. Who knows who we could be if we could become 1% better every single day.
What is up, guys? This is Alex VanHouten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing super well. You're listening to Season 3, Episode 15 of Defining Dad Bod. And this episode is called Becoming the Father You Never Had. This show's a little more personal to me than most, and so if you're looking for the science of health and fitness and how to impact your life positively and practically, we've got 100 plus hours of that content you can go scroll through. I know you'll find something valuable there. But in this show, I had the recent opportunity to interview on the show called Wisdom and Grit with Huddleston on the question, when does a boy become a man? You see, I was raised as the oldest of 4 in a single-parent home below the poverty line. So part of my journey in manhood and fatherhood has been working to become the father that I never had growing up. Spoiler alert, I don't have it all figured out. I'm still growing and learning. But there have been some very powerful lessons and events that my path has brought me through that I really hope to impart to my boys as they become men. So whether you're a young man on your own journey, a father hoping to nurture his children, or just a gal who's curious about what this journey looks like from one man's perspective, I hope you find this interview meaningful. It really was a great opportunity to share some of the most fulfilling and most painful experiences of my life. Before we get there, some food for thought. As you might know, I'm continuing my personal education journey with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition as I work on my credentialed title, Dr. VanHouten. When I'm done with this process, I'll be a certified health coach so that I can help to bridge the gap between doctor recommendations and the support of patients' everyday health. As a result of this experience, I've been connected recently with many principles in functional and integrative nutrition, and I wanted to share one with you here that I think you'll find practical. You see, part of people's health and fitness journeys don't only depend on what they feed their body, to build themselves well, to recover from their workouts, and to fuel their activities, but also from what they feed their minds and spirits. You've heard me on the show echo many mindset, spirituality, and even psychological practices frequently. The Institute for Integrative Nutrition calls these primary foods, and these are the foods outside of the physical food that we feed ourselves tend to make an impact on our health even though we don't actually eat these foods. One of these foods is titled joy. You could think of it as excitement for things that are upcoming, or gratitude in the present moment for the place, the people, and the things that are happening right now. I was challenged by the assignment to rate my level of joy on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being I experience no joy in a day, or 10 I experience all the joy that I would like to experience in a day, and then challenged with doing 1 or 2 things differently this month that would bring my joy level closer to where I'd like it to be. Now I know to some this might sound esoteric or weird, but it came to life in a conversation I had with one of my clients recently, when he was saying, Alex, look, I've worked so hard to get to this point in my life where I have some wonderful teenagers, I love my job, things aren't perfect, things are stressful sometimes, but I dropped my kid off at school today, and I thought, man, you're missing it. What I'm learning in functional and integrative nutrition, and what I hope to learn more about, is how that experience is an indication that it's time to put a little time and energy into the joy in your life. Just like being deficient in a vitamin or mineral will wreck your ability to have great energy all day, being deficient with regard to your own joy, that is gratitude for the experiences and people that are happening right now, or excitement in things that are upcoming, can significantly impact your well-being and the well-being of your family and community. So I'm challenging you. How would you rate your daily joy on a scale of 1 to 10 right now? How gracious and excited do you feel in the present moment? And are there any changes that you can make to your day-to-day that might increase the amount of joy that you feel? I love your thoughts. Shoot me a message at coachal@definingdadbod.com. I found it a powerful exercise for me, and I've made some changes because of it. That's your food for thought today. I hope it gives you something to munch on. Now, without further ado, I'm excited to share this interview that I did on Wisdom and Grit on becoming the father that I didn't have.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being here today. I'm sitting here with my friend Alex VanHouten, and we're going to be talking about just when does a boy become a man today? And it's interesting because I asked this question in the group the other day, and a bunch of guys kind of chimed in with their different perspectives, and I thought it was very fascinating because there was actually a lot of different feedback that came back over the thing, which really only feeds into the true reality of the situation being that we don't really know. And we haven't done a good job, I think, generationally of passing that baton and calling our young men into manhood. And essentially from there being the very base foundation for actually becoming a strong leader, I believe, in humanity. So, Alex, thanks for being here, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me on. And this question's so important to me. I have two young boys, a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old.
Wow.
And growing up without a father in the house, for me, this has been quite the learning curve. And so I'm looking at my boys and looking at their future and going, I want to know. I want to know when a boy becomes a man, because if I can draw that line in my life, I might be able to help guide them in theirs.
That's amazing, man. No, I can already tell you're going to be an amazing father and already have been, just from the level of questions that you're already asking, right? To try to become that man. You're aware of the scenario and really working towards making that a reality for them. So since you brought it up, you talked about not having a father in the house. Let's kind of set the stage for everybody. Like, really, what do you do now? And then we can kind of shift back and kind of do like how did it all begin for you? What was your life like growing up?
I appreciate that. So by trade, I am a personal trainer and health coach, and I am the founder of a company called Defining Dad Bod. And so what I do is I help parents kind of get out of their own way physically so that they can manifest themselves better for themselves. And then that trickles into their families and their communities. And so my line of work is a passion project, really, because I've been working with people for a long time. And I personally did not struggle with my own body composition, my own physical confidence, because of my background in education and conditioning, until I became a father myself. And a lot of guys don't know this, but mom's body goes through some really intense changes, and that's really visible, right? And thank God for the ladies. But men's bodies also go through some intense changes, biologically speaking, when we become fathers. And so, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I became a dad in a number of ways. And that passion project has grown into a business. So that's what I'm doing now. And it comes very deeply from my past in fatherlessness. So, I say fatherlessness because a lot of people kind of understand what that means, growing up in a home without a dad, but that encompasses a lot of stuff. So I guess that's what you and I are diving into today.
Yeah. So when you started kind of now taking it back to growing up for you, like, what was your story?
I was born into a marriage between a man and a woman who, I can say this all looking back, that they made better friends than it did companions, and I was kind of a surprise. But my sister and I, we experienced not abuse to us, but abuse from our father to our mother.
Right.
And he was a Army veteran. He actually slipped, hurt his back in the military. And unfortunately, that unleashed several different events for him that resulted in muscular dystrophy, which is the severe breakdown of muscle tissue, especially in the back. And that traveled to his brain. And so he manifested schizophrenic-like symptoms and beat our mom and that sort of thing. And so it was a deep imprint on me. I was about 4 or 5 years old, wrestling with those memories in adulthood. Looking back, I was 4 or 5 years old when that happened. And so that started the whole, fatherlessness thing for my household. So my mom divorced, then she remarried, had 2 more kiddos. So I have a half brother and a half sister, though we never think of each other that way. And then that marriage ended in betrayal and abuse as well, just for different reasons. And so I found myself at 10 years old, my stepdad, before he left, grabbed me on the shoulder and said, "You're the man of the house now," and then peaced out. And that was, the start of my young manhood.
That's crazy. So at that 10 years old, I mean, and all that, did your half brother and sister stay in that part of the family? So you grew up with them.
So we grew up in a single parent home run by my mom. I was the oldest, and then I have a sister, 2.5 years younger than me, and then 8 years younger and 10 years younger for my brother and sister.
Wow. So a lot of somewhat instability, and I'm sure your mom was able to hold it together to some degree, but there was quite a few different things happening, like layers to this thing, it seems.
Oh my gosh. Becoming a father myself, now I'm looking back, I'm like, how did my mom manage all of that? It wasn't perfect, but at the same time, it's like, mad respect for that woman for just not becoming an alcoholic, crazy mess in the middle of it.
Oh yeah. No, I can imagine. Yeah. And similar scenario, like my grandma, she raised 5 kids on her own in a time when that was completely unheard of, her husband had left my mom's dad, had left them when they were born. And my mom was a twin. So my grandma literally was raising twins plus three other babies, by herself, trying to work and trying to make all these things happen. They grew up in abject poverty, but I look back and my grandma, like she's still alive today, about to be 92. And like, I just have an amazing relationship with her because of that same thing. I have such huge respect for her, but I also see the damage of what not having a father in the house can do, to the kids, right? But, and to like disrupting the family unit like that. And then legitimately how that affects our legacy, right? Or our generational effects of what that is, And so I found myself, I have a lot of my own story and I won't go into that because this is really about trying to dive in with you, but like with wisdom and grit as really being a solution to that problem, not because I've like, I'm like sitting here going like, I just want to be the man's man. It's like, dude, I legitimately believe that healthy men are what are going to change this world,
Absolutely.
Christian,
Well, and not to be in spirituality and Christianity is a huge part of my story, but in the Old Testament, it says that the sins of the father are passed down even unto the fourth generation. And it's really interesting because they use that language really importantly and very specifically during that time. They didn't say the sins of the mother, they said the sins of the father. And so it's interesting how the development of true masculinity or not significantly affects every generation, no matter what your disposition toward religion or Christianity are. That's true. You can look all the way back through your family line. You start looking at your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and you start seeing whether or not there are cycles that you yourself can be a part of breaking or that you're continuing without even knowing about it.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that people understand that those can be broken, like, so it's not like you're just doomed to an eternity of having to live out, these lapses of bad programming or whatever. So,
well, and that's the second part of the verse, actually, is that the blessings of the father are passed on to the 1,000th generation. So it actually turns out that the good progress that you can make toward breaking a cycle might actually last much longer than the sins themselves.
Yeah, and the motivation inside of that. That's kind of how I'm driven, and I'm assuming you too. Like with your sons and trying to make an impact in their lives. It's like, hey, I want to be the first generation of VanHouten that's going to be like, man, we're going to go the distance,
That's
and
right.
change the path. Same for Huddleston's, man. So this is going to be a little bit more of a harder question. Like, so growing up like that, right? You handle things as they come, but there's probably a lot of insecurity and stuff that comes from feeling like an outcast, regardless of what we feel like might be an outcast, right? It's not even necessarily true, but it's just the way that humans are wired psychologically. So you probably existed in a lot of ways. What do you feel like were some of the ways that manifested itself, like in the earlier parts of your life, like having grown up not knowing, what it meant to be a man or what that would actually look like, do you think?
Yeah, good question. I can look back at my life and I can see the ways that God blessed my life so that there were these obstacles, but there was always something that could overcome them. If I ended up, 10 years old, I talked about my stepdad driving off. I lived across the street from the American School of Empty Hand Fighting, run by a guy named David Collins. And he was an ex-Green Beret, had trained at the Shaolin Temple and brought that Kung Fu mindset. And I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but no joke. He told my mom, he's like, your boy can come over here whenever he wants. Like,
oh, wow.
You don't have to pay for it. You just come. So it was him in the community of men that were a part of that. We got together and we just beat the crap out of each other. Like, I'm like 10 years old and I'm pissed. Like my whole family's broken. I'm poor. I see kids with their dads all the time. I'm pissed. Like, what's wrong with me that I'm so unlovable? So I get into the kickboxing ring with some 13-year-old much bigger than me, and I just ruin him, because, hey, I learned how to fight. And what was really nice about it is it also taught after that combat like that, you could still hug a guy and be friends with him afterward. And that was something that like really called something out of me that wasn't there before. But that's one of the ways that it manifested, was feeling outcast, but at the same time, physically fighting my way into the ring, so to speak, so that I'm not outcast. And it was important for me to have that experience.
That's really good, man. And I think that kind of stuff is deeply ingrained in us. It's like I've challenged this one guy to the boxing match, the charity boxing match.
I've been following that. I hope it goes
Well,
down.
I know, me too, man. I think it would be great, and really, it literally is from the most sincere part of who I am. I'm like, man, this would be really cool. This could be like what redefines, what peace looks like, in
That's
the country.
beautiful. Yeah. You know what? You disagree hard enough. Twitter and Facebook, let's just box it out.
Yeah, dude. And make it like a traveling road show, like where I just go around and do that. Like, hey, if you got a grudge with somebody, like bring it in. Let's raise some money for charity and awareness for like, dude, because being in the arena and talking about being in the arena, like night and day difference. I mean,
so true.
Yeah. But there's this inherent desire inside of men to go to combat and battle, and you like, there's been a couple of authors like, what's his name with, everybody in the Christian world reads his books, you know what I'm talking
Eldridge.
about? Yeah, John Eldridge. Yeah. What's that book that he wrote? The Wild at Heart.
Wild at Heart, and then his sequel was Waking the Wild Heart, and he talks about the awakening of the warrior.
Oh, okay. I haven't read that one, but Wild at Heart, I read it a few years ago, and I just remember it being such a powerful book, man.
Yeah.
Not so much that he was speaking something new into being, but that he was calling out what was already there. And it was like that was the cool part about that book, I think. But to that point, like whenever I challenged this guy to a fight, all the women in my life, who are, bold women or whatever, but it was like, they were all like, that's just barbaric. Like, why would y'all do that?
Yeah.
They didn't understand, this whole thing. And I was like, that's really fascinating because, there is this inherent desire. I think I grew up in Amarillo riding bulls. We'd fight, on the weekends. I'd fight my buddies for the front seat of the truck. I grew up as a little redneck, and so like dude, we'd be out there literally. We would fist fight for the front seat of a truck, if somebody was calling, I'll UFC it for it, and so like we'd get down. And my best friend at the time was a state wrestler, and we'd just fight for fun, a lot of times. And it would every single time, even if we got into a fight with an enemy, the next thing you knew, we were drinking beer together and having a good time, and so because it was there, that was that mutual respect.
Friends I ever made in high school was a guy who jumped me in the locker room at track practice, and I just wrecked him. Like he didn't know anything about my background and stuff. He was a lot bigger than me. Wrecked him, and then the next day after school, he was like, "So we need to be friends because that doesn't need to ever happen to me again."
Well, that's a wise man that can acknowledge that,
Oh, right, yeah. But that's definitely part of the masculine journey is, the awakening of the warrior, but also the camaraderie and actual honorable competitiveness that comes from physical, I wouldn't say altercation, but testing, the testing of your physical might against the world and each other. Love
it, dude. Okay, so you got into that, right? And that's an important, that was like kind of a side note, but I feel like it was important because it's part of what we're trying to uncover here. Is that part, do you think, of becoming a man is having that ability to go head to head with, your enemies or whatever? I know you obviously feel something towards that because you're in that physical realm and all that. And so you've kind of found that as a home base, probably.
Yeah. The discipline of the physical discipline of manhood for me, disciplining my body, working out regularly, doing things when you don't feel like it, being able to take a hit and get back up, all of those things are things that, our minds are really funny things. There's a part of your brain, people think of them as like, you have your emotions and you have your frontal lobes that, and I say people, I guess neuroscientists, but you have little pieces of your brain that are used for specific things.
Right.
But in the physical world, if you can train yourself to get back up when you're hit, to face your problems head on, to show up even when you don't want to practice. I think it was Bruce Lee who said, I don't fear the man who's practiced 1,000 kicks. I fear the man who's practiced one kick 1,000 times. 100%. And that's what, physical discipline does is it ingrains in you that I think it is an attribute of masculinity. And I don't know if you can get it anywhere else, but I'm biased, right? That being able to show up, the grit portion of wisdom and grit, being able to show up when you don't feel like it, take the hits, get back up and keep moving forward. I think that that's a very deep part of masculinity. And that started for me at that karate school with that group of guys who was, willing to father me in that way. And it was really powerful.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about your story is that component of it, that guy being willing and able to kind of reach out and show you the ropes, because I think there's a lot of guys, like I craved that to some degree and never really had it, So I had to create my own experience in that regard. Like I had to get really good at like networking and getting around people and then realizing how to build relationships. So then I would go find the best of the best of people that I could get access to, and then I would go and learn everything that I could from them. I became
I
extremely
think that's
hungry.
a powerful exercise too, that a lot of men don't realize, like I'll
Yeah.
talk to guys, especially in the Christian circles, who are like, I'm just praying that God sends me a good mentor. And I'm like, hey man, some of this, sure, like pray for that. That's great.
Yeah.
But some of this is on you. You have to recognize what you admire, because God put the admiration in you for certain people for reasons, right?
Yeah.
So you recognize who you admire, and then you pursue that person, like Jesus might have showed up at the docks with the guys and was like, hey, come here, I'm going to make you fishers of men. But the disciple had to get up and go and follow him all over the place, right? And that's a big portion of mentorship, is making the time and the effort and the energy to go learn at the feet of somebody who's worth learning from.
Bring up a great point there, man. Like that whole idea of, I don't know, you've probably experienced this, like especially in the physical world, but when you're like, dude, I know how to get you from A to B, point A to point B, right? And then you go out there and you may even like have kind of an experience like that guy had for you, where it's like, hey, come learn from me. I won't even charge you. Come on in. And they come in, and then you start, okay, like, here's what I need you to do. Shut this off, turn that away, go to, like, stop eating that junk, come in, do this, and get them down. And then they're just like, oop, they do it for a couple of days and then they're gone. Or you start following up with them and they haven't done it. And it's like, well, that's not how this works, dude. You understand this, right?
Right, yeah.
This lack of commitment to an outcome, I sometimes wonder about that, because it's like, is it birthed out of laziness or is it birthed out of confusion? Because what happens is, I think a lot of times, is that they don't actually trust you. You know what I'm saying? Or they don't trust themselves. Yeah. It really is an issue of trust, probably more than anything.
I've puzzled over this for a long time. That's one of the problems in the health and fitness world. Yeah. Devoid of masculinity. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? Like, everybody knows you should be going to bed at a certain time and waking up at a certain time. You're not doing it. Why the hell not, right? But at the same token, there's a couple things I've thought about there. You've seen Karate Kid, the old school one, right? Uh-huh. Like, wax on, wax off, Daniel-san. Like, he doesn't understand that Mr. Miyagi's got the path. He's got him down until he's consistent. And then, Miyagi throws a few punches at him. He's like, holy cow, I know Kung Fu, like, where did this come from? And that's one of the things that happens in the health and fitness world. I've given away a lot of free programs, right? Yeah. But only a few of those people have ever actually benefited, because it's almost like somebody has to pay $500 a month before they'll actually take themselves seriously enough. And Jesus said it this way: where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So for those of us who have, experienced enough pain that we're like, I'm willing to put my treasure down here, you're not throwing your pearls before swine, spending your time on me. For other people, sometimes they got to put their money where their mouth is before they'll make themselves walk that line.
Yeah, 100%. 100% agree with you. And I think that's a lot of, I was talking about just the scenarios that we're seeing with a lot of the people that are out rioting right now and all of those. If we could get enough like calmness and ability to sit down and actually create a resolution, or at least come down around the table, the reality is that wouldn't even be a possibility at this point with some of these people, because in their mind, the only thing that they have in their head is destruction at this point. So you can't reason with that, So people can say that they want something, but having the actual grit and all the stuff that it takes to kind of actually get through it is a whole other scenario. So completely agree with you. So kind of going back to now, like, so you went through that, got into the fighting and all that kind of stuff. Like, did you ever in your head, like, where was the point where you started kind of realizing like, hey, I need to become a man? Or did you ever have like kind of an awareness of that? Or was it more of just something that you just kind of like found yourself in? You're like, hey, I guess I'm a man now, or whatever. How'd that work for you?
That was quite the process for me. Physically, a lot of my journey was tied to the physical. I remember I was working a job for a guy. I was probably 17 years old, just before I actually got a full ride to Vanderbilt University, where I studied psychology for my pre-medical education. And that summer I was working, and I caught view, I remember, I actually heard your story on a podcast recently, or at least part of what you shared. And working construction, we got hot. We'd take our shirts off all the time, So, I was working, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the window, and I thought, man, that dude's jacked. And I was like, oh crap, that's me. Like, and I remember like, that was the first time I was like, I'm becoming a man,
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
But at the same time, I wasn't a man. I was like I was a boy in a man's body, you know, and I think it was John Eldredge reading Wild at Heart. And for me, he lays out Christ as a man in a way that I'd never heard up until that point in my life. I thought being a Christian, you know, a little Christ meant following the rules and accepting Jesus in your heart and praying good prayers and reading your Bible regularly. And then John Eldredge kind of was like, hey, if you're going to be a little Christ, this is what Christ was as a man. Right. And then you're like, oh, that's a man, you know, like he would get in the kickboxing ring with me if that's what I needed from him, because dude can throw a whip around like a boss, right? Yeah. So he was a carpenter before there were power tools. Like he's probably got better grip strength than I do. Yeah. So that being said, for me, being so tied to the physical, part of my journey in manhood was realizing that as a Christian, to be a little Christ was both physically demanding, but also spiritually demanding. And that to me was, you know, the beginning of the journey. And I had lots of foibles in there. You know, I had a practice marriage that didn't go very well. That's what I call it anyway. And
how old are you, by the way?
I got married right out of college at 21, and that lasted 2 years. So we were done at 23. And that, for me, that whole saga was, I thought I was a man. You know, I thought I had rescued the beauty. I thought I was on my adventure, you know, and there was a lot of other things that needed to happen on the inside before that was true for me. But
so to you, what you're saying, like being a man isn't a physical necessarily. That's just part of it, right?
Right. I tend to think, and when I'm talking to my clients who are spiritually inclined, I tend to think the physical body is the foundation for being able to pursue a better spiritual well-being. I mean, if your body, let's take a step back from my story for just a second and say, like, let's say you're sleeping like garbage, you're eating like garbage, your testosterone's in the tank, you know, you're not as muscular as you think you should be when you look in the mirror, you're not confident. Like, what kind of prayers are you praying? Like, God, help me feel better. God, help me, I don't know, have the strength to get through the day, whatever. Like, your head's not right because your body's not right. But when you get out of your own way, you feed yourself well and you exercise regularly and you get in a position where your testosterone's higher, you're sleeping enough, like you feel better. Life's not perfect, but your prayers change. You're like, God help me.
And you're more capable too, right? So I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. So you can actually go and affect change and have the energy to do, because if you volunteer your time or you get involved in trying to build anything or whatever else, you recognize it takes a toll and it consumes the energy level, right? You have to have an energy level to be able to do big things a lot of times.
Yeah. You can't minister from an empty cup. So Jesus says, if any man wishes to be my disciple, he will deny himself, pick up his cross and follow me. And I'll talk to some of the guys I'm working with. I'm like, you can't pick up a cross if you've never picked up a barbell. Like, it's hard to do that. You know?
Dang, bro, that is a whole other like side to the fitness realm that I've never really considered. You know, I do think all men should be in shape and capable, but it was like to make that the foundation. That's super fascinating. Like, that's
back in the 1800s, late 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution gave way to more white-collar jobs, there was a group of evangelicals who thought that the migration of men away from church could be fixed by engaging them in the progression of their physical well-being, because you know, they weren't working with their hands anymore. They were sitting at a desk. You know, we talk about this now, but this was 100 years ago. And that's actually what it's called, muscle Christianity. I encourage people to Google it. I think we should bring it back. But the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the FCA, Promise Keepers is a pretty popular thing people know about. That actually came out of some of those evangelicals who started that muscle Christianity movement back in the late 1800s. So I think we should bring it back. I think there's something to it.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating, man. Well, there's definitely a draw to that as a whole. When you look at like professional sports, or really sports as a whole for most people, right? But even during the Roman times with the Colosseum, you know, and the kind of the more stuff where you're getting to those really extremely physical kind of experiences, you know, there is something very primal to that I think draws men in, you know?
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So. Part of my story is learning that I'm not enough.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that quite does that to a stubborn, hard-headed guy than physical activity, because you have your limits.
Yeah.
You have your limits, and there's a point at which you go, I'm not enough. Like, I can't take this on, whatever it is,
Yeah.
with no amount of training. I'm not enough. And something about that brings me closer to God.
Well, and it's funny now that you mentioned that even too, because like that whole idea of not being enough, all the people who armchair quarterback a lot of times always talk about how easy it should be. But when you get into the arena and it's a whole other game, because you're not just watching it unfold from a single point of view, like there's literally a million different perspectives that could be, or not even perspectives, but just like angles to how this thing could actually go. And you're having to, on the spot, figure out the strategy for how you're going to progress to the next thing, whether you're running a ball, like, or whatever. And you're like, okay, well, there's 5 guys coming here and there's 1 guy coming here. I need to go up the middle. And you're doing this all in like split-second intervals where we're watching, kicking back on a chair or whatever else, drinking a beer. And then it's like, it's so easy to see like, well, dude, there's a hole right there, you moron. It's like, like that kind of thing, so like, how do we really ever become, that guy? And it really only comes from putting some skin in the game a lot of times. So
true story, where the rubber meets the road, or the hands meet the dumbbell, or the feet meet the pavement.
Yeah. So you had the physical part figured out and all that. So when did you really start diving in, and how did you dive into the mental side to kind of get to that place where you felt like would drive you to becoming the man you wanted to be?
I had 2 big things happen in my world. One, I was in my practice marriage, and at the time, let me paint a little picture for you. I got my undergraduate education at Vanderbilt, and I was the first person in my family to go to college.
Awesome.
So it was a good thing. It was a big thing. But my conservative upbringing, my mom held really tightly to her faith. And that was part of the reason that, we had a functioning family unit despite the rough start. That just could not shake a stick at the intellectual education that I was receiving. The philosophy that I learned, the biology that I learned, it was really hard. So at this point in my life, it felt like I was holding 2 belief systems at the same time in my own head. And, it showed in a lot of different ways. I remember thinking, like, I've got to figure this out before I have a kid.
Right.
Like, are we going to be reading the Bible at night before bed, or am I going to be teaching them evolution? Like, I don't know. I gotta figure this out. And if you would have asked me at the time, I would have identified as an atheist.
Huh.
So I would have told you I am an atheist who's sympathetic toward belief in a higher power. And I think it's good for everybody to do that.
Right.
That's what I would have told you. So that was kind of going on at the time. And then I read a book by a guy named David Dita called The Way of the Superior Man. Not a Christian book, by the way.
Right.
You're a Christian guy and you go read that book. I'm not recommending it because it's going to deepen your Christian faith. All right. But this book, I would say, ended my first marriage. Reading this book was like there was a lot of issues, but it brought to the surface the things that I was seeing in a way that I didn't understand that I could articulate. So both of these competing things in my world was, one, you're not showing up as a man in your everyday life, at least not according to David Dita, but I could feel it.
I like that.
And then the second thing was, you better figure out this whole, you can't hold 2 belief systems. No man can serve 2 masters. It's not going to happen. So I had to figure those things out. And my first marriage ended, and I quickly was connected with my wife now. Her name's Kristen VanHouten. She was a dietitian who worked under me up until this point. And then I was, kind of moved to departments and stuff, and like, hey man, like that girl, I've worked with her for 2 years. I know there's something to that. And our union was relatively rapid, and our son was a surprise. So I'm sitting there thinking, like, I've got 9 months to figure out this belief system problem.
Right.
Like, I thought I had time. I don't have time. I'm about to be a dad. I better figure this out. So that was really like the catalyst for me to do the inner work, was that I had 2 belief systems. I knew that wasn't going to, work well if I wanted to be the dad that I didn't have growing up. I got to have this stuff figured out. And then at the same time, I was also being challenged in a way to show up as a man every day, whatever that means, which is hard to figure out as well.
Was your wife actively calling that out in you, or saying, hey, you need to like be more of a man or whatever? Or was
my practice marriage?
Oh, well, no, the one where you had the kids here.
I would say she saw me as the man that I was trying to be, but wasn't yet.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's important,
It's very important.
Yeah.
Eve calls a lot out of Adam.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily the place of a woman to create a man, but I do think, and vice versa too, like we have a duty to call out the best in really everything around us, right? Because we create our world. This is like kind of a side note, but something that I've really learned a lot about recently is we recently moved into a new house, and there was a lot of kids in the neighborhood who don't have father figures in their life, or if they do, it's pretty rare or whatever, you know. So these kids would come over, and like my son's 8, but like they're like 13 and 11 years old and all this kind of stuff. So they're a little bit older. It's not a big deal typically, but like when you're talking about kids, there's a lot of growth that can take place in 2 to 3 year periods. You know what I'm saying? And or more. And so they come over, and at first I was like, man, you know, like you got kids from all these different backgrounds and belief systems, and you know, even if they are Christian, you know, it's like their reality is different in a lot of different ways. And so it's like now your kids are getting almost forcefully kind of entertaining all these realities in the world, you know. And it's not like you're wanting to be a helicopter parent, but you also don't want to just throw them to the wolves either, right? And so one of the things I realized as time went on, and I was like, well, I can either keep my son in a bubble, right, and try to keep him from being exposed to all of these things, or I can make sure that these kids are at our house every day, and I can influence their lives in the best possible way and unleash the greatest part of who they are and teach them how to be young men, so that now not only will they get to benefit for the future of their lives and their families potentially as well, but my kids, you know, if they're going to be around and they're going to be around those kids, I will at least have had the opportunity to impact those kids' lives so that they all see the world through the eyes of leadership, you know? And so now, dude, I have this little army pretty much running around my neighborhood all wearing wisdom and grit hats. You know, this ain't one of them, but
that's awesome.
Dude, we go on hikes and mountain bike rides. We go to the lake and swim, but all the time when I'm like, hey, boys, what do y'all think about, you know, like, what do y'all think about this over here? Do y'all want to go do that? And they'll be like, yeah. And I'll be like, yeah, what? And they're like, yes, sir. And they all yell it at the same time. And I mean, they're just in line, dude. It's cool. And they love it, you know? So, but anyway, it was kind of like one of those scenarios that you're talking about. I was in the experience, but I was calling out the better part of those people, like we should do for our wives and like our wives should do for us, you know? So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, you asked the question about, in your original question, you said, do you believe that in some form or fashion, I don't want to misquote you here, but something like, can the feminine world call out the man? And I don't believe so. I think that it's been true in my story. I might as well tell it here. I did that stuff in the kickboxing school, right? With the guys. My mom was there at first. Like she showed up and she'd work out with, it wasn't just guys, you know, it was COVID and stuff. So she'd work out and I'm sparring this kid. And she's like, well, don't hurt the boy, Alex. So I get in the ring and I get the crap beat out of me. Like just wrecked, you know, it's full contact kickboxing. You don't just try not to hurt the other person. How do you do that? So I get beat up. I come to her and I'm crying, okay? Like I'm 10 years old. I'm pissed off. Got beat up and I'm trying to do the right thing, whatever that is, while also be good at kickboxing. And my mom says, and I love her forever for this. She goes, don't listen to me anymore, Alex. Go talk to David. He was my instructor. Go talk to him and do whatever he tells you. I get back in the ring with this kid in the second round and just annihilate him, right? And part of a female's job, at least as I understand it as a mom, and this is psychologically true if you read people like Carl Jung or Eric Neumann, is to let go. Like, you know, the son comes into the world and is 100%, dependent on mom, right?
Right.
And then the rest of motherhood is letting go, you know, and that's tough. Like I don't envy mom for that.
Especially for moms that find their identity in being like about their kids, you know, which is, you know, and I get it, I do, but I'm with you, man. I think like there's some in that whole idea of what it means to be a mama's boy. You know, I'm not so sure that we should put that in such high regard necessarily, you know, in any capacity. It's not that you shouldn't honor your mother and love her and want to, you know, bless her and do things. But yeah, there are definitely women, you know, especially now. And this is not a knock towards single moms, you know, at all. Like, because I think that that's men, you know, that set that whole thing up in the first place because, you know, we're not leading well or whatever else. And so kind of going back to that and ultimately the outcome of conversations with you and like this in many other forms where we can figure out how do we call up the best in men so that they can go out and become strong leaders and ultimately their wives will be happier and healthier. Women as a whole will, kids will. We won't have, such high suicide rates among young kids and sex trafficking because of runaways and all these things that are happening because of just, men not being an active part of their kids' lives or at all.
Yeah.
And so
that was an important part of my story, being raised in a single parent home. My mom and I had a falling out when I was 18.
Really?
I was like, I'm out. I don't need you and your crap. You don't need me and my crap. Like, I'll be fine.
Wow.
And that was tough. It hurt our relationship for a little while. We have a much stronger one now because of it. But it was really important to me because I was the father figure for my younger siblings, but I wasn't their dad. And so, me trying to find my way in the world from a man's perspective, I couldn't be a father if I wasn't a man already. And I wasn't their dad, so they got along fine without me for a little while. And I had to grow in my purpose and walk my path. And that was very hard on both of us.
Yeah. Well, and that was probably a little bit of an unfortunate, reality for your mom. There was probably a level of guilt maybe that she put on you to kind of be that figure because they looked up to you. And so you probably carried that as well. And so I can understand how that would be pretty taxing, for a young guy who's trying to figure out life. It's like,
yeah, man, I was in my mid-20s before I finally was like, I'm going to let my siblings live their lives instead of worrying about them all the time.
Did you feel like you were letting them down when you decided to do that, or did you feel like you were doing something good for them, or how did you
Yeah, I noticed when I was the one calling them and they weren't the ones calling me, that it was important for me to let them, if they wanted my help, if they wanted an ear, if they needed some advice, I'd be here. That's what a good brother does. But at the same time, I'm not my brother's keeper. I don't know if I should quote Cain or not, but it's not my responsibility whether or not they manifest their best in the world. And that was a really hard thing as an older sibling to learn, given that I was being raised in a single parent home that way.
You have, it sounds like you had a pretty solid degree of wisdom as a young man, whether you knew it or not, but it was already kind of manifesting itself out with street smarts, whatever you want to call it. But it's like that whole level of being able to think in terms of that is pretty, I would think, mature, right?
I appreciate that. I think of myself as standing on the shoulders of giants and getting beat down a lot. You learn a lot when you learn a lot when you fail a lot.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that's another mark of a man too, is to be able to consistently put themselves out there into tough situations. I was listening to a podcast the other day, but I think in terms of this, but he said something about, dude, if you're worried about making, $8 an hour for minimum wage, or you're worried about all of these things that people are all worried about, and they're literally bringing, what seems to be the end of the world about with these things that they worry about, they need bigger problems. We have a bored humanity, dude. It's because they've allowed themselves to kind of cap out on, they've hit this level of what they think reality is. And they don't understand, it's like a glass ceiling to a whole other world that they don't even have the ability to comprehend.
Yeah.
And it's the only way you get there is through suffering, So while someone could make a case to say, yeah, well, this person was oppressive or whatever else, but the other I think there's another case to be said for, this will be, not to get all sidetracked, but when you look at things in terms of racism, but this has to do with just how we consider things in the world, right? The weight that is carried from living a life where maybe not slavery per se, but racism or being judged because of a color. Would James Brown have created such musical genius had that not come from a place of such depth? You know what I'm saying?
Not at all.
Or in any of these things, depth is really what makes life worth living, and the ability to comprehend. I was listening to a radio show the other day, and it was this guy was interviewing a musician who was just a classic jazz musician, an older guy. And during Hurricane Katrina, all of his stuff was just gone. He had his Steinway piano where he would create music, and all the things that he had ever held on to as dear, memories of other musicians and playing with the greats and in New Orleans, where the places he had played, all of it was gone, in an instant, And so he had to kind of relocate and redefine himself in a way. And I thought that was really interesting because he didn't at all ever come out and make it sound like it was something that happened to him. It was really like the way he kind of spoke of it was almost like, he goes, I kind of embraced it as this new opportunity to kind of hit a new level, of my existence. And I was like, beautiful, man. Like that is what it's about right there.
Yeah,
we can reach
well
that
said.
place.
I've been able to help a lot of people through exercise and nutrition, and you could hear my story now and think, oh, okay, it makes sense. You had a background in martial arts, you did a lot of sports and stuff, but my story is actually, from a physical perspective, one of suffering. So it turns out I have a genetic disorder called Ehlers-Danlos, which makes my joints, my tendons and ligaments way more lax than they should be, and so I have a lot of things wrong with me medically that make it very difficult to do things that people take for granted on the regular basis. And so people watch my stuff on social media and they're like, oh, it's easy for you to say, you're Mr. Fit and you're doing pull-ups and all this stuff. And it's like, you didn't see me when my wrists were popping out of place and my back hurt so bad I couldn't tie my shoes, like that was part of my story as well, is that suffering. And so the modern kids say the struggle is real, right? Yeah. Like that's like a first world problem thing. So I like to turn it on its head and say the struggle is real, but it's good, because at a biological level, that's how we adapt. If you stress our DNA to a certain extent, it methylates genes that code for new proteins, and you literally build yourself into something different. And you manifest some potential that was there that wasn't there before. And for some stupid reason, I don't know what it is about us humans, but only suffering seems to do that. You don't unlock anything better out of you when you're kicked back.
No.
Nothing more constructive comes out of that. But you put a backpack on and you go hike up a mountain, something changes in you and it sticks with you after that.
Dude, that's awesome. Like that was a really, really good perspective that you just shared.
Thank you.
So yeah, man. Well, dude, I love this conversation, man. I'm really glad that we got a chance to kind of jump on here and dive into that. And I appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah.
And we should absolutely do this again, because I love this conversation. I think it's important, and really diving in to really help others raise young men and young women. Really, all of these things are across the board, like about calling out the greater parts of who people are. But if you were to go back and kind of knowing what you know now, going back to the 10, 11-year-old kid that was just trying to figure life out and not really knowing how to get there, like what would you go back and say to yourself now? Like with, about how to look at the world and just letting them, from the wisdom gained and stuff, like what kind of advice would you give that kid now?
That's a hard question, get me all teared up. I'd say, Alex, there's greatness in you and it has nothing to do with whether or not your dad loves you.
Yeah, that's so good, man. Well, I think that's absolutely true, dude. Like from what I can tell, you're articulate. You're someone who cares deeply. You're driven not by fear, at least not in the form that most people are, right? But you're driven by a desire to serve, right? And to make the place better than you found it. And to me, dude, that's wisdom and grit incarnate, bro. So glad to have you a part of this organization, man, and all that we're doing and all the stuff that you're doing at Defining Dad Bod, which, by the way, you tell everybody where they can find you in that regard.
Oh yeah, I'm loud and all over the place. So you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at Defining Dad Bod, and then I have a podcast you might appreciate if you're a health and fitness nerd, or even if you're not and you're interested in knowing more about cutting through the garbage of the nutrition and exercise industries.
Yeah, that's huge, man. So it's all at Defining Dad Bod.
You got it.
Got it, man. Well, dude, thanks for doing this. This was amazing. And absolutely, I think as we continue to kind of dive into this question, like when does a boy become a man? Really, like, I'm going to be reaching out to other guys that I know who have been working with men for a long time and really trying to hone in on like, how can we handle this situation, in a better way? And it might be all over the map. I don't know yet. Let's kind of see where it goes from here. But dude, I really think a lot of what we talked about today had some great foundational pieces inside of it, so thanks for that.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. And I know we kind of ran out of time here a little bit, but I did want to say, hearing the story here, I wouldn't have called myself a man when my son was born either. It was I had a very specific experience that kind of aligned those belief systems for me, and had to do with fasting in the mountains for a while. So like kind of, again, something that you would sounds like it would be out of a movie. But if we ever get to have another conversation,
Sure, man. I'm good on time if you are. If you want to jump into that real quick and just kind of.
Oh yeah, well, I don't want to pump fake your guys, man. Hey, we're getting off. Just kidding. Let's. All right, we're done. No, just kidding.
Yeah, surprise bonus episode.
Bonus track. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
If you're willing, I'm willing to share.
Yeah, absolutely.
So shortly after my son was born, my sister, my closest sister, her youngest child was diagnosed with cancer, brain cancer. And so she's, 12 months old and she's got brain cancer. And it's the weirdest thing, like one day you've got a happy, healthy kid. And then the next day you've got a kid going through chemotherapy. And if you've never experienced real evil in the world or just existential terror and frustration, then hang out with a bunch of kids who are battling cancer. Go do that for a little while. And so in me, I'm trying to be a good dad. I'm trying to be a good businessman. I'm trying to be a good husband, in this stuff. And then I'm trying to be a good brother in this situation.
Yeah.
And, for me, this brought the whole atheist versus, being compassionate toward people who have a belief system in a higher power thing. It brought it into stark contrast because I was legit pissed at God. Yeah. Which is funny for a guy who would have told you that God probably doesn't exist. And you're like, what? Yeah. How can you be pissed at something that you're pretty sure isn't there? Right. Yeah. And so I was angry. My wife at the time, well, she's still my wife, but at the time in that moment, she knew I was going through a rough time. I was trying to manage all this stuff. And I told her one day, I was like, hun, I'm praying for a miracle. I'm like, God, if you're real, if you're there, heal this little girl. Why her? Why she didn't do anything to deserve cancer? I work in health and fitness. She didn't smoke, she didn't drink, she didn't burn the candle at both ends. Like she doesn't deserve this. And so I'm pissed. I'm angry, and I tell my wife, I'm not going to eat until I hear from God. And she's like, wow. I'm not that guy. All right. Like I'm not Gandhi. I get my protein every day, like I'm growing muscle. I don't do that.
As a sacrifice. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But in the New Testament, Christ says to the disciples who are like, why can't we heal this guy? He says, look, he doesn't say it this way, but I'm paraphrasing. Yeah. This sort of faith only comes through prayer and fasting. And it's a very biblical thing. Anytime somebody wanted to hear from God, they put down the food for a while. And so I did. I put down food. And so I was 3 days into it. We lived in Colorado at the time. So I was 3 days into drinking water and coffee. And I was still trying to work through this, and I was still trying to be there for my family and whatnot. And came to a head, and I had an open Sunday, and I was like, I'm going into the mountains. And my wife's like, okay, when are you going to come home? And I was like, after I pick my fight with God. I'm like, because that's how hard-headed I am. But, my upbringing, I kickbox, and God's a big boy. He can hang out in the ring with me. So I put on a camelback, and I went out in the Colorado mountains. I hiked, if you're ever in Colorado Springs, the hike is called Stewart Canyon. Okay. It's right outside of the Air Force Base. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth, or at least to me. Yeah. So I get up in the mountain, and I haven't eaten for 3 days. Okay. I'm in good shape, but I'm at altitude. I'm famished, but I'm I've got angry music in my ears, and I'm running up the hills, So I'm spent. I'm tired. I'm broken. It's 60 degrees out, and the sun's kind of beating down on you, and 60 degrees in the mountains is really hot. It's not hot here in Arkansas, but it's hot in the mountains. Right. And I come over this ridge of Stewart Canyon, and the canyon is covered in snow. Wow. Which is super weird because there's no snow anywhere else. Canyon's protected from the sun, and it's covered in snow. It's like a winter wonderland in the middle of spring. And I run down into this thing, and I don't know, I look up and I take my earphones out of my ears, and it's just it's there. And wow. I read in the New Testament where Paul hears from God, and he gets knocked off of his horse, and Jesus is talking to him, and and maybe he had epilepsy, who knows, and he's blind for like 3 days, right?
Yeah.
I always wondered like what that was like. And I don't know if I fainted because I was just spent because I didn't eat for 3 days. I don't know what it was, but I woke up on the ground in the snow, like, and I had a dream, and it was, dude, it was intense. I was praying for a miracle. I wanted God to save this little girl. Her name's Izzy, just to honor her. But I woke up and it was crazy. She was, I'm gonna tear up again, but she was seated. I pictured God. I don't know. I didn't see his face. It was just really bright. She was seated on his lap, and she didn't have her hair gone anymore. She had her little brown curls, and she was smiling, and she was singing. And the song that was coming out of her mouth was from Psalms, and it says, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 days elsewhere. And dude, like, there were angels around, and it was like I saw her, like she's there, and God said, he said in the dream, he said to me, she's better here. And like I kept running. I brought a notepad with me because I like to write when things come to mind. And so I sat next to a mountain pond, freezing. I was like shivering because I'm in this like canyon. I didn't know there was snow here, like shivering. And I wrote this down, because it changed me. It changed everything. And so it really sucked because I felt like I was praying for a miracle, and I'm driving home, and I'm like, she's not going to make it.
Wow.
Like I thought, but it was peace for me.
Yeah.
And that day, when all the things that I thought I knew scientifically and my upbringing, when those things came together for me, and I don't know if it's an altered brain state or what. I'm not even trying to describe it physically, but when that came together for me there, everything thereafter, I would say I did as a man, because I was put together. I was integrated. The intellectual side of me that had a really hard time swallowing the religious side of me. I don't know if anybody's struggling with that. I love it when somebody says, I'm an atheist. I'm like, great. Have you ever gone without food for 3 days and run through the mountains? Because I promise you, promise you, if you don't get eaten, you will come out of that changed.
100%. No, I agree with you. Being out in the woods, or just in general, it doesn't even have to be the mountains, but to go into the wilderness for a time, with the anticipation of just getting out there and hearing God, but also like going out there anticipatory, even if you're an atheist, right? I think your willing heart had a lot to do with that,
Yeah, well, it's like, hey man, I'm either gonna starve and won't hear anything, or I don't know, me shaking my fist at heaven might get a response. I'm just glad it wasn't a lightning bolt. I mean, he had bigger plans for me.
That's hilarious. Were you able to tell your sister that vision, or beforehand, or afterwards, or how did you handle it?
I shared it at her daughter's funeral.
Okay.
It was hard, but she asked me to speak because as you can imagine, it's very hard for a parent to speak
I can't even
at
imagine
their child's funeral. So she asked me to speak on her behalf, and so I shared it there.
Wow. That's amazing, man. No, like I've got a similar story as far as vision and all that kind of stuff. Whenever that was how it was for me too, but talking with God, a lot of my breakthrough came through that whole deal, so, and I think it's real and lasting when that happens in that capacity, it's not just something where you're second guessing yourself or whatever. It's just a moment where you just know, and that, and unfortunately, I think we should be able to call it out as men in our kids, and or father figures, whether we're a neighbor who's interested, like I call out the best of my neighbor kids because and I want them to understand, like, dude, you're actually really gifted here. I called with a neighbor kid, he was over there the other day when they were playing with these Legos, and he's really gifted he can build these really cool things,
Nice.
And I said, dude, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he's 13. He goes, I want to be a NASA engineer. And I was like, well, it just so happens I know 2 of those. I have 2 of them in my group, and so I said, hey, I'm going to call it one. Cool. And say, hey, let's get a deal. I said, hey, would you be willing to speak to my neighbor kid? He wants to be a NASA engineer. He goes, yeah, I'd love that. That'd be cool. So we're setting that up. I made him write down a list of questions before we jump on, but Very so cool. It's like, I think part of being a man is calling out those things, being willing to look into them and figure out where their giftings are at, and then help align them with what you can see them being and what they say they want to be, and then just help create connections, bring in other people if you need to help kind of call that out or whatever. So you're doing a great job, man, as a dad, and it's gonna be awesome. So, and we're gonna be in touch more. I can tell. So,
thanks, man. I appreciate it, and also thanks for taking the extra time. That for me, that end cap was important because I couldn't.
Dude, that was everything. That was
my son was born, and I couldn't quite figure out where I was in the world.
Yeah, no, that was amazing, man. Thanks for making sure that we did that. So, all right, well, dude, appreciate you being on here, man. Thanks for taking time to watch this, and like, hopefully, y'all got out as much out of that as I did, and we'll get the next one out here too, and it'll be amazing. And Alex, thanks for being here, bro.
You got it, brother. The free, practical advice and conversations here remain unbought and unbiased thanks to the support of listeners just like you. If this episode's been helpful to you, please share it with somebody in your life who you know it will benefit. Then, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a raving review to tell others what value Defining Dad Bod has brought to your health and fitness journey. And finally, if you want more Defining Dad Bod, consider joining our online community. We send a lot of free perks and resources your way, and I, Coach Alex, go live every month to talk through our listeners' health and fitness questions to make the practical science of this show applicable to everyday life. Everyone's welcome, and we'd love to have you. For more information about joining the Inner Circle or becoming a supporter of the Defining Dad Bod podcast, go to definingdadbod.com/inner circle. That's definingdadbod.com/inner circle.